Without further ado, it is my absolute honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Becky Pettit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tritons Tackling Racism Part 2. Our conversation today will focus on battling anti-Blackness. And as you've heard my colleagues say, we have an incredible set of panelists to deliver content to you today, and we look forward to a very engaging Q&A. We are at a critical moment in our country right now when it is undeniable that we are still in the fight for Black civil rights. I want to acknowledge the loss of one of our civil rights giants, Representative John Lewis, who was a tireless catalyst for change. May he rest in peace, knowing that we will keep his legacy alive by continuing to get into good trouble. The words of another civil rights giant, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., still resonate today. In an excerpt from his 1963 address delivered at the March on Washington, he said, "In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. The note was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. It's remarkable how these words still resonate today. In our webinar, we will talk about the history of anti-Blackness, the fact that systemic racism and anti-Blackness are still pervasive in America. We'll talk about how a new generation of civil rights activists are leading the way. And we'll talk about how UC San Diego is responding to this moment. My office is responsible for leading these efforts to create a diverse, equitable, and inclusive campus, but the work of liberation requires all of us to be engaged. I thank you for joining us today, and I now turn this over to my colleague, AVC, Dr. Forbes-Berthoud.
Thank you so much, VC Pettit, and it's a pleasure to join our esteemed panel today, Dr. Kay Wayne Yang, Dr. Kimberly Bem, Mr. James Crawford. Kay Wayne Yang is Provost of John Muir College and Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Before his academic career, he was a public school teacher in Oakland, California, where he co-founded the Avenues Project, a youth development nonprofit organization, as well as East Oakland Community High, which were inspired by the survival programs of the Black Panther Party. Dr. Yang helped to incubate the Black Teacher Project, which is based in New York and the San Francisco Bay Area. With Dr. Angela Booker, faculty in the Department of Communication, he is the faculty co-advisor for Black Like Water, a place-based approach to Black student recruitment and retention. The signature program of that approach, Black Surf Week, was launched in 2019 in collaboration with UC San Diego Recreation, the Black Resource Center, and the African American Studies minor. Our second panelist, Dr. Kimberly Phillips Bem, began her academic career in the College of William and Mary as a tenured faculty in the Department of History and the American Studies program, where she was an endowed chair. She then moved on to be the founding dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, then as provost and dean of the faculty at Mills College. Her research focuses on the history and culture of African Americans and US workers, and she's authored numerous articles and award-winning books. Dr. Bem now serves on university and community boards, including as president of the UC San Diego Alumni Board of Directors. And her Bachelor of Arts degree in history is from Warren College, UC San Diego. And she has an MA and PhD in American Studies from Yale University. Our third panelist, Mr. James Crawford, is entering his fourth year as a PhD student in Education Studies Department at UC San Diego. He has extensive experience in educational consulting and capacity building to center the voices and experiences and academic supports of students of color. Currently, James is the graduate student researcher for the Black Studies Project, a principal member of the Black Graduate and Professional Student Association, and he also serves on the Black Academic Excellence Initiative Advisory Committee. His research interests include Black critical theory, critical media analysis, and culturally responsive pedagogies and curricula to help transform educational systems and outcomes. So you see, we have an amazing panel for us today, and I'd like to start with Dr. Kimberly Phillips-Bem. Can you please start our conversation today by defining and helping us frame anti-Blackness? What is anti-Blackness in the background here?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Forbes Patel. I'm happy to be here. Good afternoon. I, work at the intersection of Black studies, Black culture, and labor activism. And over the course of my time as a scholar, I focused on understanding why this nation has clung so long to and invested in so much in ensuring harm, such as really violence, on Black bodies and the Black body politic. And how did these projects shape Black lives? And most importantly, Black activism. Put more succinctly, and I want to quote a young man who was just interviewed by the New York Times, who every day is stopped as he goes to work. And he says this: "There is," he said, "dignitary harm associated with the idea that your identity, your very existence, is looked at like a crime." And so, as I begin to do my own work and think about these things since then, do we find the answer around anti-Blackness in entrenched racism left over from slavery that's retooled for segregation? And as I have asked these questions and spent my time in the archives classroom and as a community activist in social justice movements, I've come to understand that anti-Blackness took organized effort at both the macro and micro levels. It has global shape, not only in the values, but in its operation. And it has served a myriad of purposes far beyond the lives of Black people in the United States. And so what this young man experiences every day of being stopped, he's part of this multi-centuries long performance that does powerful cultural work beyond just that street corner where he's regularly stopped as he goes to work. Yes, the particular contours of slavery, legal, social, and religious and physical controls to ensure the perpetuity of enslaved Blacks came out of colonization in the late 17th century. And it gave rise to anti-Black ideas that were dispersed around the globe. I mean, they traveled on the ships just as the enslaved people traveled. And part of it was that it was shaped by capitalism. Slavery was critical to capitalism. There were so many on-ramps to this. And first colonial wealth and then US wealth was founded on slavery. And thus, to justify slavery, which grew up within the context of also ideas about the expansion of human rights and freedom and liberation. These ideas grew up with the idea that Black bodies, brains, and souls worked differently from that of whites and were therefore inferior. Doctors then and well into the 20th century claimed Black people had higher tolerances for pain, though they had weak organs, which explained away all sorts of diseases not found on the African continent. And over the next 150 years, colonial laws and then Southern slave laws put in place this idea that Black bodies could be maimed, they could be denigrated, they could be assaulted, that African Americans had no control over their own children, their families were deemed unnecessary and undesirable. In short, slave owners claimed Blacks benefited from slavery and they would die without slavery. These claims of Black inferiority were used to justify, maintain, and deploy mechanisms of control far beyond slave colonies in southern states. In fact, I think when you look at the deployment of these ideas, they were attached to all sorts of ideas, idea of white supremacy, that whites were superior, white males were superior, Blacks were inferior, but also new tools to ensure Black subjugation, harm. I mean, whips, devices to cut people's tongues out. It's quite extraordinary. And thus, as Malcolm X has said, racism is like a Cadillac. They bring out a new model every year. And as we moved from, colonial to creating a nation, ideas of Black inferiority moved along with this. And here, Malcolm X, very powerful quote, I want to focus on model. It's a set of technologies as just as much as it's a set of values and ideas. In the aftermath of the legal system of slavery in the United States, former slaveholders put in place a system of Black codes that established new strategies of racial control. It allowed for both bodily harm from states and individuals. In other words, this was organized efforts, organized control. Just as African Americans were moving into freedom, in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan emerged. And by the 1880s, the Klan policed segregation as both social and violent. And thus, the harm done to Black bodies also carried over into the harm of Black political life. The 14th and 15th Amendments allowed Black men in particular, to participate in politics, both at the national and local level. But by the 1880s and 1890s, these all but disappeared, which excluded Blacks from even voting. And thus, lynching, hanging, burning, dismemberment, drowning, all of these became an extra legal means of ensuring Blacks' exclusion from political, economic, and social participation. In short, these were not simply ideas. These were a set of practices that became encoded into law, which we see in 1896, the famous case of Plessy v. Ferguson. It affirmed segregation and it left in place the range of Black codes. Not only these values and mechanisms, but popular culture, which reached beyond the borders of the United States. Lynching became forms of entertainment. They were deployed on postcards, for example. Film, particularly the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, affirmed lynching as necessary and needed and beyond the law. But there were three intertwined processes that fueled and challenged these ideas. And I wanted to show you just how this appeared in popular culture. You'll see here in 1936, this hung out of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, their offices in Harlem in New York City. I'll get to the other image in just a minute. But what I want to point out are these intertwined processes that challenge these ideas of Black inferiority and justified Black violence. Between 1895 and 1950, millions of African Americans left the South and settled in the West, Midwest, and Northeast, shifting dramatically Black population. And by 1920, over half of the African Americans lived outside of the South, which dramatically changed politics, meaning Black men and then Black women could now participate in politics by simply voting, and they did. It also allowed for the rise of the NAACP, and I think this is also linked to another process, the colonialism that reshaped the globe. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founding members of the NAACP, was in Berlin and knew about the Berlin conferences of 1884 and 1885 that carved up Africa and other areas around the globe. And he and others would become part of a global conversation, hence the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In other words, that what was happening to Black people in America was not simply based in the US, that this was a global tactic. And here we see the beginning of a new form of allyship and activism. Along with colonialism, we see the emergence of the United States as a military power. And the segregated military, from the war in the Philippines through Vietnam and Iraq, spread segregation and extra-legal violence, particularly the use of lynching, well in through World War II. They used similar tactics against non-whites, and powerful images taking place in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, for example. But at the same time, this deploying of a segregated military was problematic. But what I want to point out here is that policing and militarism became intertwined. And as we see today, the use of military force and tactics in the cities, which we saw in Ferguson, we've seen again over the past half decade, which would give rise to Black Lives Matters, is very much linked to anti-Blackness, that Black people are a threat, not just at home, but abroad, that the United States has to show its power, particularly its military power. As I said, it gets reenacted over and over and over again. This second image is a call and response to this 1936 image by and displayed in New York City in 2016. In response to this militarization of the police and this extra-legal violence, we see a new kind of Black politics, the rise of the Black Panther Party in the mid-1960s that would organize both at the community level and at the national level, but also at the international level too. And you can see these 10-point programs. And I want to draw your attention to several of the points labeled here. This idea of having control over their community, it's number 6 and number 7, to be exempt from military service and put an end to police brutality and murder of Black people. This idea of increasing incarceration of Blacks, particularly Black men, still in the 1960s, the exclusion of African Americans from juries, which would not be eradicated until 1970s and 1980s. 50 years later, the emergence of Black Lives Matter was in response to these ongoing extra-legal violence against African Americans throughout the nation. And Alicia Garza and others would form this organization in response to this. I think the call and response again to Black Panther Party is important, but also other important guiding principles. Reveal new tactics. The use of social media, I think, is extraordinary. Big data to demonstrate just the ways in which police brutality is targeted African Americans in disproportionate ways. The use of community organizing and the power of the vote. I think this is in the midst of President Barack Obama's second term, and I think it's important to understand that while this nation elected twice a Black president, in its aftermath, there was also a renewed effort to limit the Black vote, and the broad-based support of police tactics based on the militarization that I've just discussed earlier. This is in response to, in many ways, to a perceived threat of the kind of expansion of the vote, the expansion of who participated in politics, and it's unleashed an extraordinary backlash that we are witnessing today. You know, on the one hand, we could argue that many of the struggles most overwhelmingly launched by young people from the anti-slavery movement to Black Lives Matters is a demonstration of the power of activism, but on the other hand, the ways in which the backlash still is tremendous. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite Dr. Kay Wayne Yang now to talk with us about anti-Blackness at the individual, institutional, and structural levels. Provost Yang?
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Dr. Bim. You're such an inspiration, and I think I should mention that not only are you a historian, but you're doing a lot of things currently, like Reality Changers and your support for the Paths Scholarship Program that are currently addressing these issues. And that's also going to pivot to my part of the talk, which is thinking about anti-Blackness and the antidote to anti-Blackness. I'd like to start in the tradition of the Black Student Union leaders here with a land acknowledgement that UC San Diego is on Kumeyaay land, and this idea of practicing supporting Indigenous people is a practice of freedom. So I'm the provost of Muir College, as mentioned before, and another thing I'd like to point out is, interestingly, at the 7-college system that we have now at UC San Diego, we have the largest number of Black students at Muir College. 1 in every 3 Black students is a Muir College student, and this has a tremendous effect so if you look at our climate data, Black students at Muir, which is 1 in 3, rank generally diversity, religious freedom, sexual and gender diversity very, very, very high at UC San Diego. And I think some of this has to do with having certain resources and being together. And yet Black students also rank the lowest out of any group, racial diversity and class diversity. So what we understand this to mean is that campus has much work to do around experiences of anti-Blackness, and specifically, not just diversity in general. And I'm saying this because as we talk about what is the antidote to anti-Blackness, it isn't simply diversity. Diversity is not the antidote to anti-Blackness. It is actually pro-Blackness. And when we think about this at the individual, institutional, and structural level, I want us to think about what is pro-Blackness at those levels. It's interesting too that Black Panther Party was mentioned, elaborated on by Dr. Bim, and my own experience with having started a school that was in a nonprofit inspired by the Black Panther Party school. I want to talk about that school really briefly. So this school was opened from 1973 to 1982, and it obviously didn't have any police at the school, but what they had was a restorative justice program. This is things that people are calling for now in 2020. The Black Panthers had instituted in the 70s. They had dormitories to address students who were housing insecure. They were providing free breakfast and free lunch, and this is before the federal government did so. So in the 70s, the Black Panthers were feeding more children in California than the state of California every day. They had a yoga and martial arts class, and in general, their curriculum was called World as Classroom, and this was actively not xenophobic. So they were ultimately recognized, not I would say ultimately, but they were recognized by the California State Assembly for their excellence. I had the luck to meet people who founded the school, and Erica Huggins, who ran the school for 6 years, was the highest ranking woman in the party. Coincidentally, she's speaking next Wednesday with the Black Teacher Project, which is something that we helped incubate here at UC San Diego with my friend and colleague and founder, Dr. Misha Mosley, and also a student, now alumni, Rachel Locke. So all this to say that we are inspired by these programs that the Black Panthers called survival programs. And Erica Huggins always emphasizes this. She said the most important work wasn't protests. It wasn't looking fierce, although that was important. It was actually these many, many programs that built institutions and changed politics and changed individual thinking. And so that leads to the slide on what is individual, institutional, and structural racism or structural anti-Blackness. One of the things I want to emphasize about individual anti-Blackness is this is usually what the US dominant narrative around racism is. It's like individuals with prejudice or individuals with bias. And if anti-Blackness were so simple that all we had to do was change a few individuals' minds, or even many individuals' minds, we would have actually already been there. And but anti-Blackness is pervasive. It's in institutionals. It's institutionalized. It is built into our systems, and thus the failure to act is actually anti-Black. Unawareness is actually anti-Black because it's in the air conditioning. Neutrality is actually anti-Black. At the institutional level, this plays out as not only reversing discriminatory practices, which I think we've done to great extent, though some still exist, but it's also acknowledging that when institutions simply reproduce themselves, when we simply try to build the university forward as we've always done, that is anti-Black. It is negligence that is also anti-Black, negligence to address the problem and to transform ourselves. So slow reforms without institutional transformations is actually reproducing a system of that Dr. Bim has laid out. And then finally, structural anti-Blackness is, and this is a great quote because it's actually about health inequities. And when we think about the context of COVID-19 and how this has played out for Black communities, we see the tip of the iceberg of structural anti-Blackness, because this is the totality of all our systems of housing, education, media, healthcare, criminal justice, so on and so forth. And it's built and reinforced and rebuilt our history and our culture. And so this is the legalization. So structural racist anti-Blackness has to do with the legalization of anti-Blackness. There's no better sort of shocking example than how vigilantes, and I'm not even talking about police, but vigilantes can kill Black people with impunity, right? This is a continuation of Jim Crow. This is a continuation of Fugitive Slave Act. This is also a continuation of California Indian genocide. So when at the founding of the state of California, any person could kill or enslave an indigenous person with impunity. In fact, you're rewarded for it. The first 10 years of California's state legislature, $1 billion was allocated for the genocide of indigenous people. And this was largely done through private bounty hunters and militarized private individuals. And the other aspect of structural anti-Blackness is the normalization of it, right? And this gets to the quote by that I have here that unfortunately I cannot see my slide, but Racism Without Racists is the title of a book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And we don't need racists for anti-Blackness because we can simply do nothing today and we will participate in an anti-Black system. So neutrality is anti-Black. We talk about the shelter in place and this desire to return to normal, but what happens is normal is already anti-Black. So the desire to return to normal, as we see, what does normal healthcare look like for our Black communities? What does normal policing look like? What does normal schooling look like? And so wanting normal is anti-Black. And I think this speaks to our new generation, Gen Z or whatever you call them. And this is a generation not to be trifled with. They do not want normal. And that is the type of activity, non-neutrality, pro-Blackness that we need to combat anti-Blackness. So some ideas around pro-Blackness and inspired by the Black Panther Party and their survival programs. So if you think about survival programs such as the ones I've mentioned as pro-Black programs, creating institutions. Here at UC San Diego, we have the Black Studies Project directed by Professor Jessica Graham. And so that's a scholarly endeavor. We have things like Oasis Summer Bridge, which becomes sort of the crucible for many of our incoming Black students to build community and build network and build consciousness. We have the Black Resource Center, but I want to mention a few new projects. This one is connected to UC San Diego via our alumni, Alicia Garza. So Alicia Garza, as you may know, is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter and is a UC San Diego alumni. And her newest organization is called Black Futures Lab, and it's about building Black political power. And this also reflects back on the Black Panther Party. They ran for political office. They were the first people to run for mayor of Oakland. And I think were the harbingers of the first Black mayor in Oakland, California. So Black Like Water, which was mentioned earlier, the signature fund program is Black Surf Week because it's about Black people's relationship to land and water and to belonging and to place, which has been denied throughout US history, that Black people are always displaceable and somehow movable at all times. Well, we also have the Ida B. Wells and Carter G. Woodson seminars. seminar series. We launched that with, I think, a seminar on research projects. And our next project that we are starting a campaign for is a Black feminist residency at John Muir College. Would like to host it, where we bring some of the leading minds that are shaping the next generation of Black politics and Black futurity to spend a year in residence in an apartment overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And then finally, the Black Academic Excellence Initiative. This is from the VCEDI's office, and things like this are attempting to address institutional transformation. So how do we create carrots? How do we create the inspiration for all of us at UC San Diego, whether it's at Muir College or in our academic programs or in our departments, to transform ourselves towards Black excellence? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Provost Yang, for helping us see more about the contours of the individual, institutional, and structural context related to anti-Blackness, and for making plain that normal is actually anti-Black. We appreciate all your perspectives there. We'd like to turn it now to Mr. Crawford. And could you please speak with us about anti-Blackness and pro-Blackness, as Provost Yang was explaining, as concepts, and how they relate to your experience?
Definitely. Thank you so much. So prior to entering the UCSD Education Studies PhD program, I was a restorative justice coordinator working primarily in the Long Beach Unified School District. And so as an RJ coordinator, I co-created initiatives with administrators, with staff, with teachers to center the experiences of students of color, particularly the disproportionate disciplining of Black students. So that was one of the key issues that I was addressing within the middle school and high school areas. And so right now, what I want to get into are examples of anti-Blackness in education before I get into some examples of pro-Blackness in education. And so looking at these following two slides, basically they're going to make connections between what Provost Wayne was talking about in terms of these individual, institutional, and structural dynamics that perpetuate anti-Blackness as a fundamental aspect, specifically within American schooling. And then recognizing how American schooling itself is part of the social reproduction of our society, right? And so understanding these elements help us to understand the ideological and material consequences of white supremacy and how they impact the everyday lives of Black students. And so when we talk about bias, we hear a lot about bias, that everyone has biases and so forth, and that may be a part of the individual expression of anti-Blackness. But it's also important to note that anti-Black bias is, again, historically rooted in the cultural memory of our society, and is therefore fundamentally connected to the maintenance of institutional and structural anti-Blackness as well. And so to kind of highlight this element of bias, Walter Gilliam of the Yale Child Center recognized, quote, that implicit biases do not begin with Black men in police. They begin with young Black boys and their preschool teachers, if not earlier, end quote. And so Gilliam and his colleagues came to this conclusion after conducting a recent study with 135 pre-K teachers to assess their implicit biases. And so they instructed these preschool teachers to watch a few short videos. And so there were 4 children in these videos. There was a Black boy and a Black girl. There was a white boy and a white girl. And these preschool teachers were told to identify each time they saw a quote, behavior that could become a potential challenge. So they had to press a button every time they saw on the screen when they identified a potentially challenging behavior. What they were not told, these preschool teachers were not told that none of the children were actually displaying challenging behaviors, because again, the study was actually looking at using eye scan technology, the amount of time that these teachers were looking at the screen, specifically at different students, right? And so the findings of the study basically were expected based on the rates at which children are expelled from preschool programs. So quote, teachers spent significantly more time looking at the Black children than the white children, and they looked specifically more at the Black boy. So again, this idea of bias, when we're talking about in the current discourse around police brutality, This professor out of Yale identifies how this implicit bias occurs even before adulthood. It occurs even as early as preschool, and he says, if not earlier. So again, speaking to this cultural memory and the ways in which we're socialized within this society to being inculcated towards anti-Blackness. And so when we move forward to think about how do these implicit biases also impact policy, we think about, for example, from a critical race theory analysis, how various education policies can be recognized as mechanisms for reinforcing institutional and structural dynamics that perpetuate whiteness as property. And so Dumas and Ross, for example, highlight how whiteness as property is reflected in various educational policies and practices that maintain disproportionalities in areas such as school discipline, testing, tracking, as well as the access to culturally relevant curricula. And so when we're talking about moving on to curriculum, education policy scholars in various ways demonstrate how debates over curricular standards over time and currently are deeply political and ideological. That is to say that particular forms of knowledge and assessment have been developed over time to minimally accommodate calls for cultural relevance while still aligning with dominant interests and paradigms of whiteness, right? And so moving on to discipline, how students are interacted and treated within the classroom and on campuses as well within higher education, we see this connection when we're talking about discipline and education, the connection to this history of social control for Black bodies and Black people, right? And also this history of academic access when it comes to integration. So what does it mean once integration occurred, once Black students were in more proximity with the predominance of having white teachers. And so we see in terms of discipline that since the 1970s, the Black-white suspension gap widened greatly since the 70s. And then by 2010, Black students were over 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students. As well as looking again at even preschool age children are 3.6 times more likely to be suspended from preschool than white children. And even though Black children account for roughly only 19% of all preschoolers, there's still nearly half of all preschoolers who get suspended. So again, going back to the Yale study that I mentioned previously, those same scholars indicated that when we look at how teachers are spending more time focusing on their Black students and expecting bad behavior, we see that same correlation with the increased rates of suspension and expulsions, right? And so we also see when we talk about schools with proportionally more Black students having more likely use of punitive exclusionary discipline policies and practices, and they're less likely to use restorative techniques when responding to student behavior. So moving on to access, right? So this is something that really going to speaking to the current moment when we're talking about COVID-19's impact on schools and universities and how it reflects broader social inequities related to access to technology and other learning resources. So that's ultimately led to what is now being termed the homework gap. So now what we're looking at in terms of this homework gap is how an average student lost as much as 7 months of learning this spring, with an average of 10 months of learning lost for Black students, right? So this higher disparity of disruption based on COVID-19 related issues in terms of access to technology. And finally, again, looking at higher ed, students of color losing employment at a greater rate, losing the ability to afford college, and specifically Black college students are more than 2 times as likely to attend an institution at risk of closure due to COVID-19 related issues. So taking all that together, we see there are a lot of, again, individual, institutional, as well as systemic factors, right? Structural factors that maintain anti-Blackness. And so now we're going to look at some examples of pro-Blackness in education. And so when we're looking at bias, as I previously mentioned, this pervasive bias that is as early as preschool, we see that studies indicate equitable experiences and outcomes for Black students are intimately tied to the underlying beliefs and commitments of institutional agents, such as teachers and administrators. These same teachers are the teachers that are allowing students to access gifted classes, are allowing them to take advantage of various resources and become, you know, the full students that they can become. And so when we talk about bias, we're talking about also shifting that through what's called culturally responsive interactions. And so there's a methodology that allows teachers to better and more deeply empathize with students of color, specifically Black students, so that we can break down these barriers to interaction and to success. And so moving forward with policy, we're seeing different policies such as the Crown Act that came out last year and was passed, prohibiting the discrimination of natural hairstyles. And that was the first legislation passed at the state level in the US to prohibit that type of discrimination, as well as looking at policies such as the repeal of Proposition 209 and the passage of Prop 16, which we're hopeful for, so that we can have the potential of increasing enrollment of Black students in higher education, including here at UC San Diego. Curriculum, really briefly, working under the guidance of Dr. Chapman and Dr. Jones out of Education Studies here at UC San Diego. I worked with some of my colleagues to work on a multi-year pilot of an ethnic studies curriculum at a local San Diego high school. And some of those findings were actually demonstrated that there's a significant impact on students' critical consciousness, their engagement, and academic outcomes when it comes to having ethnic studies. And ultimately, this research helped support other longstanding grassroots efforts, which have led to the San Diego Unified School District Board approving an ethnic studies graduation requirement by 2021-2022 school year. And so looking at discipline, as has been mentioned previously, restorative justice has been utilized as an approach to improve school learning environment and student behavior, focusing on repairing harm, involving all stakeholders, and ultimately transforming community relationships, again, shifting those biases. And then when we're moving on to access, an example of pro-Blackness in education, I would cite this example here of earlier this month, the United Teachers Los Angeles, which is the main representative of staff in LAUSD, basically this document articulates the need for rethinking yet again this idea of getting back to normal. Because we know that the norm in American education is this perpetual racial inequity that has now been exacerbated by the pandemic. So ultimately the UTLA document, it identifies specific resources that are needed at this time of increased trauma and precarity, including increased staffing of counselors, psychologists, increased academic supports to address learning loss, increasing federal, state, and local funding through specific policy changes and reallocation of funds. So again, when we're talking about our current challenges that we're facing as a society, as a global community, and we're recognizing specifically anti-Blackness, we know that yet again, returning to normal is not an option, that various changes need to take place in order for pro-Blackness and the support of Black lives and Black students to actually come to fruition. So I thank you for my time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Mr. Crawford, for outlining for us the material and structural processes and consequences and outcomes of our educational system that relate to anti-Blackness. So I thank all the panelists for their amazing and brilliant insights. And we're now going to answer some of the audience questions that came in. And I will start first with VC Pettit from a question that we received about accountability at UC San Diego. The question is, what does accountability look like for UC San Diego's efforts for enacting proactive policies and actions to directly combat racism, or for acknowledging growing calls of action from the campus community? VC Pettit.
Thank you for that question. Last year, we facilitated our strategic plan for inclusive excellence, the first accountability meeting, where we provided every unit leader all of their data. So we created an accountability profile that had presence of faculty, staff, and students. It had success, such as completion rates and so forth. It had climate data. speaking to how each constituent group is experiencing the UCSD climate. It had equity data. It had comparison data, how we are doing compared to our peers and our aspirant peers. We gave that to every unit leader and asked them to tell us about the state of equity, diversity, and inclusion within their units. What are your strengths? What are your opportunities for improvement? And how will you get there? And my office is partnering with all of the unit leaders to improve in areas where we need to improve and to fortify and strengthen the things that we are doing well. So that's accountability. The chancellor, the executive vice chancellor, the EDI advisory council all received this information. And then we gave the unit leaders feedback as well. So that's accountability. We will do that annually and hold everyone who has a leadership position accountable for improving in areas where necessary, and also being real clear about expectation for progress. So I'm grateful for that question.
Thank you, VC Pettit. So we have a question here. I'm thinking that Dr. Bem could start off and then our other panelists could chime in. And the question is connected to history, given Dr. Bem's analysis and explication earlier. What are the distinguishing characteristics of this year's racism and racists?
It's an interesting question. I would come at it from, where do we, posit or what assumptions are we making about, protests? And I'm assuming that we can link it to that. And I think what I find very, very interesting are people making claims about how protesters operate or what they're protesting about, or that the data, there isn't anything as such thing as structural racism. And as I mentioned in my comments, I think that the two arenas where people return to address those claims, one is to use data. Going back to data, the New York Times has been tremendous in looking at the disparities from everything from COVID-19 to arrest. And I think recently, just today, about the ways in which young children, Black children in schools are far more likely to be beaten using corporal punishment in states that have had a long history of lynching. That's fascinating, big data. The other is the use of video. Video has absolutely changed the terms of the debate in many, many instances. I think most distressingly, for example, with George Floyd and what happened to Christian, and I'm blanking on his name, the gentleman in Central Park earlier this spring.
Thhank you. And so we have about 8 or so minutes left. So I'm going to ask to Mr. Crawford and Provost Yang the K through 8 question, and then we have another question about racism in corporations. All right, so the education question is from a K through 8 educator. I'm a K through 8 educator. What racist practices are many elementary and middle school teachers still are unaware of that put barriers up between teacher, classroom, or school and families? It's not our families or friends' job to inform us, it's our job to learn. I know there are things that we will do that we haven't learned yet. Any suggestions? There are many books I'm reading and I'm seeking knowledge in webinars, but fall will be here fast. And policy-wise, what are common things we need to change or stop doing tomorrow for K through 8 educators?
Just to start off with, as I mentioned, my experience specifically working with middle schoolers was around restorative justice. And so when I would enter into a school environment, one of the key things was looking at the uniqueness of that school context and recognizing and leveraging the commitments of the administration. Because when you're trying to shift a school culture, oftentimes the modeling of that shift has to occur from the top down, so to speak, and also horizontally from teacher to teacher, from staff member to staff member, and so forth. So part of that, I would say then, is to see how do you start off developing a critical mass of administrators and teachers and staff who are on board with that shift and who are able to come together to envision what specific changes need to take place at that, at that school site, because every school is different. So looking at the data again of whatever disproportionate levels of disciplining or academic outcomes and disparities related to test scores and so forth, if they're seeing that trend specifically with Black students, being able to go to, each, subject matter area to say, okay, what can we do within our language arts department? What can we do within our social studies department to specifically address the needs of our Black students within our school? And then to also think about the broader community dynamics of what are these students facing and experiencing outside of the school. And by understanding these things, teachers and administrators are more likely to humanize and engage in humanizing ways with their Black students such that they can help empower the Black students as well.
Thank you so much. Provost Yang?
I just want to amplify what James said. Restorative justice, I mean, people are wondering, how can I do abolitionist work? That's abolitionist work, is you create alternatives to policing children in this case. I think two more things. One thing from James's slide is culturally relevant pedagogy. So why are our classrooms, I was a math teacher, so culturally relevant pedagogy in math class, what does that look like? And if we're not doing it, actually surprised we are doing it. We've been doing culturally relevant pedagogy from a very much like white supremacist point of view. It's a certain supremacist culture that we've been putting forward. So we're doing it already. And so we got to stop doing that and be proactive in doing culturally relevant pedagogy. I think one resource is K-12 ethnic studies. It's a complicated field being in ethnic studies. And one thing I want to point out is ethnic studies is not the study of ethnic groups. It's not that everyone gets their own study, right? It is actually developing a vocabulary of race so that our children today can actually have critical conversations about race and, in this case, anti-Blackness. That's really the purpose of ethnic studies. And so why are schools not doing that already? I think, again, going back to this idea is if you're not doing something, if you refuse to act, it's anti-Black.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll ask the question on corporations, and I think maybe a minute to respond to that because we also want to leave enough time for VC Pettit's closing remarks and alumni's closing remarks. The probably last question will be, I see many corporations making statements against racism. However, as stated, quote, racism doesn't need racists, unquote. How can corporate America better address anti-Blackness? About a minute from panelists.
I will begin. I'd love someone else to answer this as well. Statements are the bare minimum. I think folks rushed to do something because they didn't want to miss the moment. And it's better than nothing, but it's just a start, right? So I would encourage individuals to do their own audits, to ask who's present, who's not around the table in our business, right? Who is in the boardroom, who is doing the service work. Ask about the quality of folks' experience there. Start a reading group. So there are things you can do that are concrete. It will be, it should be tailored to your own organization. I encourage whoever is asking that question to ask your people about what would be helpful in your own environment.
Can I add something really briefly? I just wanted to say, it stands out to me that, for example, Amazon is obviously within this online reality that we're having to live very, flourishing very well. And so, Jeff Bezos is on track to become the world's first trillionaire, as far as I understand. But to look at the production processes and again, corporations as a system. So asking the question of where the products produced and what are the conditions under which the workers are being asked to work and produce the items that we're all enjoying, as well as the benefits and the health benefits, again, that are allowing the workers to thrive. What are the mechanisms for advancement within these companies? What's the amount of ownership such that the concentration of wealth isn't continually going to the top of the corporation? So yeah, just rethinking all the way around, what does it mean to have a corporation that not only produces a product or service, but also provides a sense of well-being for the producers of those products and those services.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump
Thank you
in?
so much. Sure.
So I
30
think
seconds.
it's addressed the wealth gap, right? So my niece, Ryan Walker Hartshorn, was at Condé Nast magazine where they made some big statement, and she was the lowest paid only Black staff there, right? There's also a venture capitalist org here in San Diego that has created a fellowship targeting underrepresented people within venture capitalism. I'm a big fan of Black Wall Street, Madam C.J. Walker, building Black wealth. I think that is something that corporations can do.
Thank you. And so thanks to our panel, Dr. Kimberly Phillips-Boehm, Dr. K. Wayne Yang, and Mr. Crawford. I am pleased now to turn it back to VC Pettit for final thoughts to inspire hope for the future.
I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I encourage you to find your place in this moment, find your place in this movement. Educate yourself about racial justice by reading and learning with others. Volunteer your time, speak up, use your platform, and vote. And you can also consider giving to UC San Diego. And for those who are thinking about ways to be involved in your own environments, stay tuned for the Chancellor's Anti-Racism 21-Day Challenge. That will give us some real concrete actions and really rich discussion opportunities. I begin with a tribute to the life of John Lewis. And I want to close with his words that you only pass this way once, so do all you can. Thank you all so much for attending today and for your very insightful questions. I'm going to turn this back over to my colleagues in advancement.
Thank you everyone for such an amazing program, and thank you all for all the wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. I think we could talk about this for half the day with this amazing panelist and still have questions. But thank you all for contributing and participating and logging in. You'll see on this slide the various resources and information that you can do to learn more about how UC San Diego is providing support on this topic, as well as to go and learn more so that you can equip yourself to be moving forward on this topic and in this area. As a reminder, these slides will be sent out after this program along with the resources, so you can access this afterwards and a recording of today's webinar. We hope that you continue to stay engaged and have some upcoming opportunities for you to be engaged with UC San Diego. We have our Tritons Tackling Return to Learn webinar on September 24th at 9:00 a.m. Please go ahead and make your registration for this program. It's going to be very exciting to learn about the way UC San Diego is leading the coronavirus response. Additionally, we have some programs that are about continuing professional development. So we have our Triton Table Talks and we have our platform Tritons Connect. And for information on the latest information on COVID-19, you can join us at returntolearn.ucsd.edu. Thank you again so much. We look forward to having you at our next webinar and continuing the conversation. Have a wonderful day and go Tritons.